Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where today we're going to have the big reveal. And Joseph is going to finally let his brothers know who he is. So, in case you haven't been following along with us, we'll try to make a long story very, very short to get a sense of where we are now as we start chapter 44. So, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, who at that point didn't like him so much, and he ended up through this whole series of events becoming the second in charge in all of Egypt. And Pharaoh had a dream about the fact that there would be 7 years of good harvest and 7 years of famine, and so they saved up all this food under the direction of Joseph, and they were able to deal with these 7 years of famine. And up until this time, he had been separated from his family and perhaps never thought that he would ever see them again. But because of this famine, it's amazing to see how God takes all these details and kind of blends them all together to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. But as a result, just like Abraham had to go to Egypt because of a famine, now Jacob is forced to send his sons to Egypt. And this is what we talked about last time, their first trip to Egypt to get some food. And it's here that they meet their brother. And up until this point, they still don't know that this was their brother. Of course, he recognized them immediately. And he was being very, I guess you could say, over-interested in them. And they couldn't figure out, why is he so interested in us? You know, we're just like probably thousands of other people that have come here to get this food and to get this help. And why is this very high up person in Egypt so interested in us? And he's asking us all these questions. Well, we know that when they went back, he had given them, they had purchased their grain, or at least they thought they had purchased it. He sent them back, only he snuck the money that they brought back in their sacks, so that when they got home and they opened up their sacks with all the grain, they realized the money was still there. They were thinking, oh no, we are in big trouble now. They hadn't got a clue as to why that money was still there. Of course, this was part of Joseph's plan, and we talked a little bit about that. Why did he do that? And I think one of the reasons the primary reason was because it was kind of a way to test them. And we have to remember that, they hadn't seen Joseph for all this time. He hadn't seen them all this time. And he didn't know what was going on back in his old hometown. He didn't know the dynamics of what was going on in his family. Were they still even together as a family? How was his father? And what about his brother? We'll remember that Jacob was not in any way ready to send his brother to Egypt. So Joseph's brother Benjamin, his youngest son, Jacob's youngest son, whom he loved more than any of the others, and there was not a way in the world he was going to send him to Egypt. So Benjamin at this point stayed home. But Joseph has a plan now to I guess you could say, reunite the family, and at the same time put forth this test to see really where the hearts of his brothers were. So this is kind of where we're at now at the whole storyline as we start chapter 44 of Genesis, and we start by reading the first verse. Now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his house. Fill the men's sacks with as much food as they can carry, and put each man's silver in the mouth of his sack. Then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain. And he did as Joseph said. So now why does Joseph do this? This is similar to what he had done the first time they were there. And, the first time they opened up their sacks when they got home and they saw the silver, we're in big trouble. And I don't know what they were thinking when they go back the second time. Now, they were forced to because they ran out of food. it had been probably a couple of years since their first visit, so the food was gone, and their lives depended on it. So as fearful as they might have been, they were forced to go back. And this time, we'll remember that they had to bring Benjamin with them, because that was one of the stipulations that Joseph put before them on their first visit. You must bring him, don't even think of coming back here without Benjamin. And he had this whole ploy about accusing them of being spies. And, so he said, you're telling me you've got this brother. Well, of course, he knew they weren't spies, but he came up with this whole plan in order to get his brother to return. So in order to prove to me you're not spies, you got to bring your brother back here, this youngest brother. Of course, his motive really was that he just wanted to see Benjamin. And as I said, he knew that they weren't spies. Well, let's continue on and see what happens here. As morning dawned, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph said to his steward, "Go after those men at once, and when you catch up with them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses for divination? This is a wicked thing you have done.'" So they're just, happy to be along their way. Everybody's returning. They've got everybody with them. And these guys catch up with them, the stewards of Joseph, these Egyptians. And they're ready to really shake him down. Open up your sacks. And, they're telling him, you walked off with Joseph's cup? And what was this cup? Well, it says it was something that he drank out of. I don't know if you drink coffee, but, I always have my favorite cup. And I think I've broken about 3 of them up to this point in my life. But I still have my favorite cup. If it's not dirty, that's the one I always grab to have my coffee in the morning. I don't know if that was what this cup was like or not, but it also talks about it as being used for divination. And what does that mean? Well, we have to remember Joseph had been totally enculturated in the Egyptian culture and all the things that they believed and practiced and the religion. Now, we do know that he was faithful to the God of his father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And, of course, he acknowledges. Remember when Pharaoh said, "You can interpret my dream," and he said, "I can't interpret your dream, but I know my God, that he can interpret your dream." So we know that Joseph's heart was still loyal to God, the God of his fathers. But at the same time, he's probably picking up a lot of these habits, and maybe that was just something you would do. I don't know, like we have lucky rabbit's feet now that, part of our culture. Anyway, this cup was more than just a cup. And it wasn't just because it was made of silver. It was something that was a valued possession of Joseph. So to steal it would have been really, a bad thing. And I think we're coming to see now why Joseph does this and why he puts it in the sack of Benjamin. Because this would mean that Benjamin was going to be held accountable for this theft. And the real question in Joseph's mind is, how are the brothers going to respond to all of this? Because really this is part of what he's trying to find out. Are they going to stand up for their brother, or are they basically just going to throw him under the bus? Well, let's continue to read verse 10. "Well then," he said, "let it be as you say. Whoever is found to have it will become my slave. The rest of you will be free from blame." Each of them quickly lowered his sack to the ground and opened it. Then the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. And at this they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and turned around and went back to Egypt. I mean, things were going so well. And remember, Joseph had this big party for them, and they had this big feast, and he gives them the stuff and tells them to go home. But now they have to turn around, having been accused of this horrendous crime, in knowing that this would be extremely important But again, it's all part of this test that Joseph is putting them through. So they go back and they said, how can we prove our innocence? We didn't do this. They're pleading with him and knowing that they're pleading for their lives. But he says, don't worry, you guys are free to go. It's the person that I'm going to keep here is the one who actually was responsible for stealing the cup. And of course, he knows that Benjamin didn't steal the cup, but this is his plan to really test. This would be the ultimate test of his brother's loyalty to their brother Benjamin. And what happens next? Well, we find out, we won't read all this part of the story, but basically I'll summarize. They plead for innocence, and then Judah, and now this is interesting, Judah is one of these, one of the brothers, stands up and speaks out in behalf of his little brother. And it's interesting because Judah is the one who initially said, if you'll remember, when they were talking about killing their brother Joseph, Judah is the one that pled for his life and that said, no, let's not. And he goes on to explain to Joseph that it would just destroy his father if we didn't bring this, Benjamin back to his father. It would destroy his father. And so he's pleading on behalf of his brother as well as his father. It's an interesting thing about Judah as well. Eventually, all of the tribes, we talked about the fact that, these 12 sons become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And each one of these tribes goes on and retains their identity for centuries, which is really a miracle in itself. And each tribe sort of has its own characteristics. In fact, one of the tribes had really turned its back on God and was no longer mentioned in the list of tribes of Israel, and that was the tribe of Dan. They had just kind of gone off and totally turned their backs on God. But Judah, it's interesting that his tribe becomes the most powerful tribe in all of Israel. In fact, every single king of Israel is from the tribe of Judah. Or most of them were from the tribe of Judah. So it becomes this royal tribe, which is interesting. Well, we continue on. Your servant, my father said to us, this is Judah continuing to speak to Joseph, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces. That would be Joseph. And I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave. So this is giving Joseph some more insight, realizing that his father was profoundly affected by his being gone. Again, he had no clue where anything that his family was thinking, including his father. Maybe he just said, okay, well, I lost one son, but I got another one, so everything's okay. But I think when he hears this whole story about how he literally would die if he didn't see Benjamin, and that he had been living a life of mourning for his son who had, he thought had been killed. So Joseph hears this and he's reminded of how much his father grieves for him. Now, continuing on to verse 30. So now if the boy is not with us, I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. And this is the way he more or less sums up his whole argument. How can I go back to my father if Benjamin is not with me? And this brings us to the end of chapter 44. And now we see what happens next at the beginning of chapter 45. In verse 1, and Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard all about it. I think he just gets to the point now where he understands that his brothers had truly repented of what they had done to him. And also that his father was back there home grieving for the loss of, this first son that he had. And I think this just, all the emotions just sort of catch up with him. And he can't hold it in any longer. He has to tell them. So he tells all the Egyptian attendants and servants and whoever else was there. So it's just him and his brothers. And in verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. If you learned that this was Joseph and the last thing you did with Joseph was try to kill him, I think I would be a little nervous too, wondering what in the world is he going to do, and understanding, totally that you would have deserved all kinds of punishment. And that if it was me, that's probably what I would do to myself if I had, found myself in that position. Verse 4, then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother," he says a second time, "Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." So he mentions even, I know, I am your brother. And he reminds them, I'm the one that you sold into slavery. How would anybody else have known that? That was their big secret, that they were keeping all these years. But how does he respond to them now? And they're sitting there thinking that, okay, it's the gallows for us. Or prison for the rest of our lives, or we'll be slaves the rest of our lives. And Joseph would have had every right to reasonably do that. But he has this attitude of mercy. And I think the reason is because he understood that this went way beyond, the actions of his brother. But this was something that God was doing in his sovereign plan to save Joseph's family. And not just Joseph's family, but all of Egypt. And what happens next is, this is where the story starts getting good. He says, okay, this time you don't have to bring a bunch of food back with you, because you're going to go home. You're going to pack up your father and you're going to bring him here. And I'm going to give to you some of the best land of Egypt, in Egypt, to live in. And he basically resettles his whole family. And to make it even better, Pharaoh gets wind of all this. They heard all this commotion going on as Joseph was crying out. And finally the story comes out, and the Egyptians learn, Pharaoh himself learns that this is what was happening, that these were Joseph's brothers that he hadn't seen in all these years. And Pharaoh himself, and I think you have to understand how much Pharaoh would have appreciated and wanted to honor Joseph for basically saving his neck and saving the whole country. And so he would do anything for Joseph. So he bankrolls this whole move. He sends, if it was today, it would have been like probably sending Air Force One to go pick up Jacob and bring him back home. Of course, they didn't have Air Force One back then, but he had whatever he had, these Egyptian carriages and carts. And I mean, this was going to be done in style. And when they finally get back to see Jacob, this is, again, this wonderful message that they have to bring to him. He has a little trouble believing it himself, but we kind of conclude everything here by reading verse 25 in chapter 45. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, and they told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is the ruler of all Egypt." Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And, he finally is convinced that this must be true. You can imagine how unbelievable that must have been to him. This idea, and with all these years you thought, well, I saw his coat, it was all covered with blood, and the animals must have devoured him, and he's been living with this reality, or with this truth in his, or what he thought was true in his mind all these years. And now to hear that Joseph is not just alive, but he is in charge of all of Egypt, it must have just blown his mind. I'm thinking maybe the only reason he really believed them was because he saw all these carts that Pharaoh had sent. He said, I know those aren't our carts, those are Egyptian. And so the things they're saying must be true. And so this is kind of a happily ever after story. Well, if you go a little farther down in history, we see things kind of, turning a little bit, but we haven't got to that part yet. In fact, that's the whole next book of Exodus. We follow their time in Egypt. But I think we have to remind ourselves, as we talked about last week, not last year, that this prophecy was given to Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, Joseph's great-grandfather, that his descendants would end up in Egypt for 400 years. This was a specific prophecy. And so now, through this whole event, another byproduct of this whole event, and maybe you could say that's the reason all this stuff was happening to begin with in God's mind, is that it carried out, it brought about the fulfillment of that prophecy that Abraham's descendants would live in Egypt for 400 years. I guess, that might have been interesting for Abraham to know. Of course, he doesn't live to see that day, and I don't know if Joseph had heard that story himself or not, but the one thing Joseph did realize is that this was all in God's hands. And that those dreams that he had as a young person all finally came true. How do we conclude? I want to kind of conclude and maybe thinking about this whole life of Joseph, and thinking about the fact that the stories in the Old Testament, as we said, reflect spiritual truths that are universal. And there are some really interesting, almost amazing similarities between the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus. So what are they? Well, I've come up with 6. Now there might be more than that, but these are the ones that seem to be pretty obvious to me. Number 1, Joseph was the favorite son of his father. He grew up in a privileged, situation. And within an instant, he lost that position. Jesus, where did he grow up? Well, he lived in heaven with his heavenly Father. And he willingly, and he wasn't sold into slavery like Joseph was, but he willingly left that position, that place in glory, and came into this world in order to accomplish God's purpose for us. Second, Joseph was suddenly taken away from his life of privilege. Now with Joseph, it wasn't voluntary. Jesus willingly left his position in heaven to come into this earth. Number 3, Joseph was falsely accused and put in prison. Remember Potiphar's wife? She accused him of abusing her when, that wasn't true at all, but he ended up in prison because of that. And Jesus also was falsely accused during the trial that led to his crucifixion. The Bible makes it very clear that there were false witnesses. These were people that were paid to come in and tell lies about Jesus so that the Jews would have some legal reason to convince the Romans to kill Jesus. So that's another similarity. Number 4, Joseph shows mercy to the ones who wanted to kill him. And we see exactly the same thing with Jesus. When he was on the cross, what did he say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he was talking about those same people that had just nailed him to the cross. The people that had killed him, he pleads in their behalf. Father, have mercy on them. So that's a really big similarity. Joseph brought salvation through, everything that happened in his life in interpreting these dreams and then administering everything that Pharaoh told him to do. He brought salvation to all of Egypt, and to not just his family, but to all of Egypt. And in the same way, Jesus brings salvation to the whole world when he came into this world and died on the cross for us. And then finally, and like I said, there's probably other ways in which we can see similarities. But finally, Joseph, where does he end up? He ends up in a really good place, along with his family. He is, in probably some ways you could argue, maybe one of the most powerful men at that time in all the world. That God had elevated him to this high position. And in the same way, Jesus, one day, when he comes back the next time, it's going to be as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So we can see these parallels, and I think that's part of the amazing thing about the Bible and how it was written, that God has his hand in all of it. And I think we can be encouraged. Well, this doesn't actually end everything that happens in Joseph's life. There are still a few more things that we need to wrap up, and we'll be doing that next time as we move on to chapter 46 in Genesis. I hope you'll be able to join us then on Gen Z Bible class.